Hello and welcome to the latest Science of Sport podcast. I'm your host Matt Solomon, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Jake Colley-Davies. So Jake is the owner of Caradoc Conditioning, a business which he uses to help rugby players achieve their athletic potential, making them fitter, faster and stronger. So who better today to discuss how you can improve your rugby fitness? So without further ado, it's time to welcome him onto the show. So Jake, welcome to the Science of Sport podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So can you give us a quick introduction as to who you are and what you've been up to until now?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Jake Colley-Davies, otherwise known as Caradoc Conditioning. So Caradoc is my middle name for people who know me but don't know that. I'm a strength and conditioning coach, and I work predominantly with rugby players, not exclusively, but predominantly with rugby players, amateur rugby players, and usually between the ages of about 14 to 30. Again, not exclusively, but that tends to be the kind of lifetime of a lot of rugby athletes in general. It's not the longest sport in terms of how long you can play. But yeah, I work with predominantly online athletes at the moment. I'm working with about 140, 150 athletes online. I do stuff in person as well, but I feel like I can get my hands on more athletes when we're working online, which is beautiful. And we put out a lot of education across social media as well to help the athletes who don't necessarily want to come aboard and join.
Absolutely excellent. Nice stuff, mate. So when it comes to rugby, what are the key physical characteristics which are necessary? Because it's obviously a sport dominated by big people, heavy people, but also there's little fast people, there's huge, great big ugly people. Like what's going on there? There's so many different things that need to happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, I love this question. I made a post a few weeks back, essentially just coining rugby as the ultimate hybrid sport. Like you get exposed if you don't have any of the kind of physical qualities that you can kind of list. You've got athletes who are 130 kilos, potentially playing for 80 minutes. Obviously, there's a bit of stop and start there, but they're expected to be mobile, agile, fast. They're expected to be able to last that amount of time, so have the aerobic endurance and capacity to do that. There's periods of the sport where it's very isolated in what you have to do. So like going off of a scrum, for example, the forwards themselves are putting almost like one rep max squatting it, and then you've got the backs who are just in that almost one-on-one scenario where they're catching and then doing agility. So I think it's just absolutely everything. But like with everything, it has that overall underpinning of strength, which underpins it all, and then aerobic endurance, which helps with the conditioning and everything. And then if you can keep them mobile, so with the agility or accessing as much range of motion as possible, those three things together, you've got it all. So everything.
Short answer is got to do that. Got to be good at everything. But absolutely. When you're working with people, so you mentioned 14 up to roughly 30, but let's say you get a 14-year-old in and they're like, right, okay, it's just starting to get a bit serious for them now, maybe some academy stuff going on, and maybe they're having to get into the gym for the first time. What kind of physical characteristics does that 14-year-old have compared to like the big 30-year-old who's been there, seen it and done it, and has had all of those, let's say, approximately 16 training years to get there? How do they differ? Because they're going to be really, really different human beings, right?
Yeah, and I just want to kind of bring us back to the fact that there are two very different, like you've got the forwards and you've got the backs, and sometimes you'll have a young athlete who comes and the forwards and the backs will be completely different. So you'll have two very different scenarios here. Overall, usually the biggest difference, not only between the ages, but also like being from like a lower grassroots amateur level all the way up to elite, is fat-free mass, how much muscle they have. And that's probably the same across a lot of sports, right? So it's not just rugby. So the priority for a lot of these athletes that are coming in is going to be gaining a bit of weight, building a bit of strength. And because they're doing so much play, hopefully, with all of the sports that they're playing, with what they're doing in activities at lunchtimes, at school, at college, they've got the agility, they've got a lot of the fitness that is being built from that. If they're light, they also don't need quite as much fitness to then, be running on their feet and kind of, it's not the same as if they're, 130 kilos. The engine that you've got, it doesn't quite need to be as much. So a lot of them are okay with the fitness. A lot of them are quite agile and mobile, even these forwards, but then it's the strength and the muscle that they really need to build. On the other side though, when you do have that athlete who comes in, unfortunately what happens a lot early on with rugby, if you do have somebody who's bigger, more overweight, they just instantly get lumped in with the forwards. And for them, the strength, obviously, it's still important because they haven't had the opportunity to develop the strength over the main movements, the fundamental movement patterns, but they are quite big, and that priority is probably getting them just doing a bit more activity in general and bringing down that body weight, so their relative strength. But it's still, relative strength, fat-free mass are the indicators there.
And I'm rudely interrupting to make sure you're up to date and aware of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. Now, the Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses, which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. So if you're enjoying today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, all you have to do is hit the link in the show notes and you get in there completely for free for the next 7 days. So hit that link in just a few minutes' time. Absolutely excellent. And obviously you kind of want to get them to the stage where they can be that big, huge individual with a great aerobic base, quick, agile, all of those great things. What does a pathway look like for those athletes to go from someone who's come in potentially lacking fat-free mass and lacking maximum strength through to a professional athlete who has those qualities and can then express them during the game?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you're taking these athletes. I mean, this is something that athletes in general, all players of all ages, which probably have a pretty similar approach, in my opinion. But when you're talking about them coming from 14, the emphasis has to be on enabling them to play their sport as much as possible. Because it's not only that they don't have maybe those physical characteristics, but they don't have the technical, they don't have the tactical, and that's how they're going to get better at rugby. Obviously, we can enhance that with what we're doing inside the gym, but that's the priority here. So making sure that you're structuring the training in a way that it's not interfering with that too much, and that does get really difficult because you'll have, some athletes that will come in, they're playing 2 or 3 games, or they've got multiple sports, they're playing them all at the same time, and you've got to make sure that you build the things they're missing, which is usually the strength. They're not going to need you to add in much more speed and more agility, more fitness, because they're just getting so much of that in the open play that they're getting in their sport and in their training. So you don't want to interfere with it too much. The strength is probably that main thing that you need to focus on the most. That's going to enhance their power. That's going to improve their ability to stay out of injuries, as opposed to adding to the injury risk if you might be going too far. And that's just going to enable them to develop further and further on. As you get through that process, you might, that they're probably going to start dropping off in terms of the amount of sports that they're playing. They're probably going to start specializing a little bit more in rugby. And I think it's important that you play into that and you take that into consideration. So yes, they're going to be specializing, but it's not time for you to start specializing as a strength and conditioning coach. They've still got a long way to go in terms of their general preparation, building the strength, continuing to build up that muscle mass. It might just mean that you have to start replacing almost, or adding in a little bit more from the speed, from the agility side of things, now that they're not getting so much of that out in the open play, in the playground, in their multiple sports. But also they're getting heavier, and because they're getting heavier, it might be time that they start needing a bit more of an engine, I like to call it, building up that aerobic endurance, because they've got more weight to move around the pitch, so it's something they need to work on.
And when does that start to happen then? So obviously you mentioned increase in weight, that's kind of a logical through puberty that's going to happen. But when should athletes start to be looking at adjusting the way that they train in order to maximize their athletic potential?
It's a really hard one to give a definite answer on, especially in rugby. You can have a 13, and this has happened with athletes who are brought on board. You can have a 13 or 14-year-old athlete who is physically and potentially emotionally, as in more motivated, more confident, can take on board advice and communicate with you better at a better point than potentially a 17 or 18-year-old. So it's really hard. It's obviously, as you can imagine, got to be on the individual. And I think if you are, whether you're the coach, the athlete, maybe the parent, it's usually quite obvious at this kind of age what those weaknesses are. So if somebody is not fit out on the pitch, it's very obvious, right? If somebody is lacking the strength or the size going into these collisions, it's pretty obvious. And when you're going from that like 13, 14, 15, all the way up to 18, you start to have children playing against adults. And that's a very obvious matchup. It's actually, they're in the Southern Hemisphere, they've got, they're bringing out, they've got that new league and the new categories where they're actually putting people, I believe it's 85 kilos and below against each other, kind of irrespective of the age. And that's taking off really, really well because you just don't have this big mismatch in terms of the injuries, but also at this age, you have a lot of drop off in terms of participation. So people will get put off. The smaller kids are going to go into these big collisions. They're going to get put off, or they're going to get scared, or they're going to get injured. And it's really key that, you know, we're working on that. So building up the strength is also going to help build up the confidence. And that's something that I like to focus on a lot. You know, having a holistic approach. It's not just about getting this athlete in the gym. It's making them more confident as well and helping them enjoy the sport.
And obviously, when kids are looking to progress to like a professional level, right? Like there's a lot of progress that they need to make. Because if I look at myself when I was 14, I was big and gangly, but absolutely zero mass. So like you could be asking kids to be putting on maybe 10 to 20 kilos of muscle mass in the coming years. Like how quickly does that progress need to happen?
I can tell you how quick it usually happens. In terms of needs to happen, it's a difficult one. You've got to balance with rugby, unlike a lot of sports, and at least rugby in kind of Europe, it's different. Over in the Americas, they split it up a little bit more. They've got more off season, but you just don't have that opportunity. You've got to bear in mind you've got, you know, 3/4, at least 2/3 of the year is put towards in season, and that does slow things down a little bit. It's all right being in a surplus because, you know, it's probably going to benefit you overall, but you can't just absolutely go for it. You've got to bear in mind that if you do end up gaining a lot of weight over a short period of time, you still have to play with that and you have to run with that, and you've got to put those forces through your legs. We know how much of your body weight goes through different structures in your lower body as you're sprinting and stuff. And when you start adding to that, you reduce your fitness, you reduce your speed, your agility, and so you can't do it at too much of a rate. The rate that I usually recommend for athletes across the board, kind of regardless of age, is usually no more than 1/4 or 1/2 kilogram per week. If it gets any more than that, then it just ends up being too much. So that ends up being, 1 to 2 kilograms every month over the course of a year. That's where you can kind of get that 10, 15, 20 kilograms worth. Now, that's not all going to be from fat-free mass, but sometimes that's okay. We're in a sport where you're carrying stuff into contact. Having a bit of padding around your shoulders, around your body in general, it can be desirable if you can still move it around. So it's not like a lot of sports where some of the fat mass is completely, it's a no-go. It doesn't help you, it hinders you. It can help with momentum, it can help a little bit of contact. So it depends if you're talking about just the fat-free mass. But yeah, like you said, over the period of 4 years, let's say, which would take an athlete kind of entering this 13, 14, 15 area into complete adult rugby, 10, 15 kilograms, 20 kilograms of lean mass, it can be expected, and would definitely help them.
And can you walk us through how you've done this with an athlete before? So I'm interested to hear how that process works from like 14 all the way through till someone going up to potentially the professional standards. How does that then look when they're working with you?
Yeah, so especially early on, like I was saying before, we don't want to specialize too much. It's a lot of compound movements through a decent range of motion that is going to help you build as much muscle as possible, essentially, and as much strength as possible for as much range of motion as possible. So those are the big things here. They're going to make the biggest difference. So usually when I take an athlete through this, let's just say if they're pretty busy, might have 2, and they're in season, it might be 2 full body days where they've got 4 or 5 main compound movements. They might be taking it through 3 to 4 sets of 4 to 6 reps. I like that 4 to 6 rep range in terms of blending that strength and hypertrophy. So they're getting in enough volume to get, it's heavy enough for them to get stronger, to produce more force, but with building muscle being really important for them at this age, it's also kind of ticking that box. So in general, it might be a little bit higher on the reps and volume, and then as they kind of progress through and they get bigger older in terms of their training age, more advanced, then maybe you start chucking in a few 2 reps, 3 reps and stuff. But I usually keep that out of the way with some of those younger athletes. So it's working on that, keeping it interesting. A lot of the time when you've got an athlete and they're going in the gym and they're seeing progress every week, a lot of them just get motivated by that as it is. Or when they're showing up, one of my athletes turning up to the game on the weekend, and all of a sudden they're getting, you're looking bigger, or you're playing better, or this or that, and that brings that motivation in itself. Sometimes you do have to add a little bit more of a play element to it, so having a bit more fun with the training as opposed to just, this is very much just go in and do this because it's going to make you better. And if you're not already quite experienced with your training age, people get bored of that quite quickly. So that's really important. I think that's something that a lot of athletes in general of all ages could probably benefit from. It's just a bit more play and gamification and keeping things interesting. Don't just stick to the same boring, 5 sets of 5 on bench press for 5 or 6 years. Experiment with different variations, find something that you're enjoying, improve your movement literacy by trying different variations, making things harder, but start it off a little bit more basic at the start, and then you can expand that later on. I think that's the way I usually go for that approach. And if you're looking at the kind of improvements you can make, one of my athletes, Evan, he was 15 at the time when he joined. Over the course of 12 weeks, it's absolutely feasible, and he did this 20 to 30% improvements over those main compound lifts, like over the squat, over bench press, over like a trap bar deadlift or something, and that continues, and you can kind of milk that until it starts to slow down, and it will inevitably slow down, but having that kind of massive improvement, it makes a big difference out on the pitch. They're growing a lot of muscle by building up and targeting all these muscles, and they're having fun doing it because they're making so much progress.
Absolutely excellent. And when you flesh out that session, I'd be interested to see what an example session would be like, because you mentioned a few compound lifts and some set rep schemes. Can you just talk us through, if an athlete walks into the gym with you, what are they doing from exercise 1, warm up, whatever, all the way through till end of the session?
Cool, yeah. So let's make it simple. Let's just say it's a full body session. Then we'll hit a little bit of everything. So because we spoke about this at the start, you need everything for rugby. I don't think anything should leave the program at any point. So there's always elements of it. So I like vertical integration. I'll just change the priorities in terms of how much I'm doing, how often they're getting it. So they'll always come in. They'll start off with something, they'll do their warm-ups, they'll do a bit of preparation. Then they'll go into something a bit faster. So plyometrics, jumps, throws, something like that. Then they're going to come in and they'll do, if they are going to do Olympic lifts, they'll do something of an Olympic lift. They might do something that's a little bit more power focused, so moving moderate weights a little bit fast. I don't tend to do too much of that. Then they go into their main strength compound lifts. So for some of the younger athletes, that's where the majority, in my opinion, of the session goes, and the majority of their progress is going to come from. So that's where they'll have 3, 4 main movements in that kind of 3 to 4 sets of 4 to 6 rep range. Obviously, we'll get below that and above that. Then ticking off a couple of things in terms of if they want to build up, if they really do need to build a bit more muscle, targeting those areas, the shoulders especially, going into contact, maybe some of the areas that you've just highlighted are visually lacking a little bit, or those areas are a little bit weaker. And importantly, in this kind of area of the program, that's where you hit those key injury sites. So things like hamstring, neck, the shoulders, that's where you build up those areas because they're commonly injured for the athletes of that age, but also just a lot of athletes in the sport in general. If you want to finish things off, then you can do a bit of fitness or conditioning. So it's always ordering it in that way, but I like to change the volumes in terms of the focus. So in the off season, it would be, for an athlete in general for rugby, it would be less of the power and the throwing, more of the strength and hypertrophy, maybe a little bit less of the conditioning, depending on the athlete. In season, you might have a little bit less on the strength and hypertrophy, and then you've got a little bit more in terms of that faster stuff or the power, but it depends what they're doing, obviously, what their history is and what they're doing the rest of their week as well.
Absolutely excellent. So Jake, massive thanks for your time and effort today. It's been a pleasure talking. Where can people find a little bit more about you and what you're up to?
Yeah, so I'm basically at Caradoc_conditioning across socials, or if you just search Caradoc Conditioning, you'll find it up. Feel free to reach out if you've got any questions or you ever want to contact me.
Perfect. Thank you very much, buddy. It was a pleasure talking. I look forward to speaking again soon.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Ciao, mate. And that's it. Once again, a massive thanks to Jake for all of his hard work on today's podcast. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure you do at home too. Before you leave, I want to point you in the direction of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. And the Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. So, if you enjoyed today's podcast and you want to get your hands on some more great sports science information, all you have to do is hit the link in the show notes so you can get in there completely for free for the next 7 days. What's more, every time you complete one of the courses, you get a certificate of completion which will prove your ongoing education. And if you have enjoyed today's podcast, it'd be fantastic if you could recommend it to a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. That means that we can keep bringing the best possible guests and the best possible content. And that's it. Once again, a massive thanks from me. I'm Matt Solomon of Science of Sport, and I'll speak to you next week.